Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Middletown Independence Day celebration. My name is Ron Ross from Sirius XM Satellite Radio, The Pulse, Channel 15, 6 a.m. in the East, Monday through, what am I on? Friday. Right, yeah, okay. Occasionally on Saturdays and Sundays. On stage a little bit later on this evening, it's going to be Ghost Peppers and then the fireworks. Now, you could start the fireworks, but you have to enter the raffle to do so. You have to do it at the Middletown Rec Council tent, which is to my left and your right from the shelter. It's a big white tent. Just go there and you pay your money for your chance. You get a ticket, and if you win, then you literally will get to press the plunger that will start the fireworks. If you mess that up, if you don't press the plunger all the way down, if you press it off to the left or the right, or you don't press it at all, then the fireworks won't go. So the responsibility is on you if you win this. We want to thank our sponsors today for the Independence Day celebration. And they include the Middletown Recreation Council, also Gaber Holdings, the Valley Grill Sports Bar at Hollow Creek, also Paul Graberstein.com. He's the one who's been running all the sound. He's the guy under the big hat and the movable tent. So a round of applause for Paul, because he's getting everything. He's getting all the bands set up. He's making everything sound good. He's doing it on the fly, as they say, at the very last second. So we thank Paul for all the hard work that he's doing. And also the town of Middletown. Thank you so much for coming out. If you're hungry, there's plenty of food. There's Roy's Concessions, Country Concessions, Keep It Smokin' Barbecue, Big Daddy's Kettle Corn, Maggie's Bake Shop, Maui Wowie Hawaiian, Volcano Drinks, and Lions Club Ice Cream. Don't forget our vendors who have their crafts. There's jewelry, there's services, all kinds of cool things for sale. If you want to check that out up in the parking lot on the other side of the shelter. All right, as part of our military tribute for this day, this very important day in U.S. history, we want to welcome to the stage, and he's going to explain everything that's going to be going on, but renowned bugler, Jari Villanueva. Let's hear it for Jari Villanueva, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jari Villanueva, and I am a bugler. And it's really a pleasure for me to be here in Middletown this afternoon. And what I'm going to do is present a short program on military bugle calls. And we thought it would be appropriate, since we're coming up to the 151st anniversary of Gettysburg, that famous battle that took place not so far from here. And also, we're in the heart of Civil War history, of course, with the battles of Sharpsburg or Antietam that took place back over 150 years ago. And also coming up with the 150th anniversary commemorations of the battles that took place around Washington, D.C. Of course, the one that's coming up within 2 weeks is the Battle of Monocacy. There are special events happening there on July 5th, and I'll be there with the Federal City Brass Band. That's a Civil War brass band I play with, for ceremonies at 11 o'clock. And then we're moving over to Frederick, just right down the road a little bit, for the anniversary of the Ransom of Fredericks. And what that will be is, for the entire day, that Saturday, July 5th, they will be having reenactors throughout the streets. They'll have Confederates will be coming through demanding a ransom from the mayor of Frederick of 150 years ago. So they're going to recreate that. But back to what I'm here for today, that is, as a bugler, to perform military bugle calls. And what I'm going to demonstrate for you in our program this afternoon are calls that were used by the armies 150 years ago. And these were the bugle calls that basically told soldiers what to do. Everything that a soldier did during the day was regulated by the sound of the bugle, from getting up in the morning, to going to breakfast, to falling in for drill, to going off to march, to being told when to go to sleep at night. Bugle calls also regulated and maneuvered troops on the battlefield itself. So to start off with a soldier's day in the Army, of course he would wake up to a very familiar call, a call that is still heard today at all military bases. And that, of course, is the bugle call called what? Anybody? Reveille. I heard the word reveille. Well, back then, believe it or not, the pronunciation was reveille, because just like all bugle calls during the Civil War, they were derived from the French. And the pronunciation of reveille is sort of an American thing. Of course, we all know it today. If you've served in the military, you would hear that call early in the morning. And of course, there would be words that would go to it. Words, of course, something like, I can't get them up, I can't get them up, I can't get them up in the morning. The corporals worse than the privates, the sergeants worse than corporals, the captains worse than sergeants, and the colonels worse of all. Okay, some words like that. And back during the Civil War, they used words to memorize these bugle calls. Now, in the morning, of course, when you got up, you heard the bugle call of reveille, you would get up and you'd get ready for the morning's duties. If you were in the cavalry, you'd hear a call right after reveille that was very important. And that was the call of stable call, because if you were a trooper with a horse, before you took care of yourself in the morning, you took care of your horses. Now that call went something like this. Go to the stable as quick as you're able and groom off your horses and feed them some corn. Because if you don't do it, the captain will know it, and then you will rue it as sure as you're born. So go to the stable as quick as you're able and groom off your horses and feed them some corn. Stable call. Now, what was interesting back then was that the horses knew these calls as well as the soldiers. And when that call went off, you'd hear the horses, they start going crazy, stamping their feet and crying out, because they knew that they were about to be fed and groomed. So stable call was an important call in the morning for those, for soldiers and cavalrymen. Of course, followed after that would be calls for breakfast, sick call, and then drill. Of course, the call for breakfast was really important, because if you were in garrison, it meant a chance for you to line up and get that first morning meal. And like I said before, a lot of these calls that came from in the Civil War were originally derived from the French. So this call might sound a little different to the breakfast call that we would hear today, or mess call that we would hear today. Come and get your beans. Okay, that's the call for breakfast. And of course, afterwards, there'd be calls for assembly, calls to fall in for drill. And then sometime during the middle of the day, there would be a call that would be sounded that would release you from drill. And that was the call that was called recall. Usually followed by a large hurrah from all the troops, because they knew that the drill session or work session was over and that they could go back to camp. In the middle of the day, there would be the call for dinner. Okay, they fed the troops basically twice a day, breakfast and dinner. Dinner was the big meal of the day, usually happened around midday. Then afterwards, you'd have more drilling. And then in the evening, you'd have the call of retreat. Now, that doesn't mean to run away from the enemy. The call of retreat was the call to end the official duty day. And then afterwards, the soldiers would have a lot of free time before hearing the final calls of the day. Now, in the Army during that time, there were 3 roll calls that were taken every single day. The first roll call happened at Reveille. The second roll call happened in the late afternoon at the call of retreat. And then the third call happened at the call of tattoo, which was in the evening just before the lights out. And those things are still used today in the United States military. You still hear reveille in the morning to get the day going, the retreat in the afternoon, and then the tattoo in the evening just before the last bugle call of the evening. So basically those were calls that were sounded during the day in garrison for all the troops. Now on the battlefield, the bugle was very, very important. At the beginning of the war, they usually used fifes and drums, and they were very important in massing all the troops together and having them move out together as one. And the drums would keep the steady cadence as the troops would move into battle. But it was the bugle that was found out very quickly that could relay calls over a great distance, telling the troops what to do, so that the commander didn't have to shout out commands at long distances. And some of these calls were very, very useful. You know, the call to march forward, for example. The troops would go forward. To get them to stop, you'd play the call of halt. Simple enough. You hear that call, you stop marching. Now, if you wanted to have the troops go forward by the right flank, okay, you'd play a little bit of the forward, and then you'd have notes going up. Okay, the troops would then march off to the right. If you wanted to go to the left, you'd play a little bit of that forward call again, but then the notes would go, anybody? Down, right. You guys would make good infantry troops. Okay, now if we wanted to fix bayonets, there was a call for that. You didn't have to shout it out. Fix bayonets. Unfix bayonets. Commence fire. Ceasefire. Okay, that's just a few of the 50 bugle calls that was used by the U.S. military, the United States Army, and the Confederates used the same calls too. And believe you me, they got kind of confusing on the battlefield when you hear all these bugle calls going off at the same time. And so in order to differentiate the certain different bugle calls, sometimes regiments would have their own little bugle call to play as a prequel to the next call. So that way they would know that the bugle call was for them. For example, Dan Butterfield, who was a brigade commander, wrote his own little prelude bugle call. And when his bugler sounded that call, everybody in the regiment would know that the next call would be for them. And that call sounded like this. That'd be became known as the Dan Butterfield call. Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield. Later on in life, General Butterfield would tell people that sometimes when the things got really, really rough in battle, the troops would start singing, damn, damn, Butterfield, Butterfield. Now, Butterfield is very important in the world of bugling, as he is the general that is credited with composing America's most famous bugle call. And that call, of course, we know is the bugle call of taps, which is sounded every evening at United States military bases around the world. It's still a tradition that's done. It's also performed at military funerals every single day. And we're gonna finish up my program by talking a little bit about how that bugle call came into existence. And it goes back to old General Dan Butterfield. And Butterfield was the son of a Utica, New York businessman by the name of John Butterfield. And Butterfield had come into the Army, enlisted with a New York regiment that finally went off to Washington. He rose to become a general officer and given the command of a brigade. Now that brigade found themselves down near Richmond, Virginia in the latter part of June 1862. And Butterfield liked to compose bugle calls. He composed, of course, that Dan, Dan, Dan Butterfield call that I just played for you, but he also composed other calls. And it was recorded that in one battle, he actually took the bugle and sounded the charge during a crucial part. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his coolness under fire during that time. Anyway, following what was called the 7 Days Battle, which took place at the end of June 1862, Dan Butterfield summoned his brigade bugler, who was a 23-year-old bugler from Springfield, Ohio. And what he did was to tell him that he did not like the regulation call of lights out. Now, to explain about lights out and everything, we have to go back to that evening calls that I had talked about before. Now, in the evening, when the troops were finished with the duty day, they would usually have time to write letters home or had free time, but they had to be available and present, well, they had to be present for the final roll call of the day, and that was called the tattoo. Now, the tattoo itself goes back many, many years, goes actually back to the 12th century. And the tattoo, the word tattoo, comes from the Dutch. And it's a sort of a mixture of a Dutch phrase called din tap toe, which basically means turn off the taps. It was a signal not only for the soldiers to fall back in for the final roll call, but it was a signal for all the barkeepers in town to turn off the liquor for soldiers. And they usually would have a drummer who would go through with a provost officer through the town beating the call of tattoo. It then became, in the American Civil War, a bugle call. And it's one still played today. It's one of the most longest bugle calls in the United States military. Now, at that time, the bugle call of tattoo had gone through a couple different revisions. And what I'm going to do for you next is play for you the call, the 1861 call of tattoo. Now, this call that I'm about to play is no longer played in the military, but it was used at that time. But at the last part of it, you can actually almost hear a bugler singing those words of tattoo, tattoo. So listen closely for that. And this is the call of this is the Civil War tattoo. And I hope you enjoy it. It's the longest call in the military. Isn't that a wonderful call? Can you imagine hearing that in the evening, sounded through all the camps and echoed around? Well, that was the call for the soldiers to return back and answer to the final roll call of the day. About half an hour later would come the call to go to sleep, put out the lights and go to sleep. And that was a call called Extinguish Lights. And like all bugle calls that I've played so far, they all came from the French. And in the military manual at that time, the call for lights out or extinguish lights was a call that was borrowed from the French and dates back as far as 1808, and actually was Napoleon's favorite bugle call. And that call sounds like this. This is where General Butterfield enters the story. See, Butterfield did not like that call. He thought it was just too formal sounding of a call to put the men to bed. Okay. Now, what was kind of interesting was that after the bugle call was sounded by the bugler, a lone drummer would usually beat 3 distinct beats on a drum. Tap, tap, tap. I guess I should have used the drum behind me, but that's okay. That was known as the drum taps. That also told the men, go to sleep. And the soldiers then condensed it to just calling it taps, okay? So we had this bugle call of extinguished lights followed by the drummer playing those 3 beats. But Butterfield did not like that, so he summoned his 23-year-old brigade bugler, this kid by the name of Oliver Wilcox Norton, and had him come into his tent and said, look, we need to change the call. I don't like this call. What I'm going to do is give you some music that I've jotted down. And what General Butterfield gave him was music from an old bugle call that had gone out of use prior to the Civil War. And what he did was to take the last 6 measures of that and rewrite it into those 24 notes that we know today as the bugle call of taps. First sounded that evening in July of 1862, it soon spread to other units of the Union Army. In fact, the next morning, after Norton had played it for the first time, he was approached by other buglers who came up to him and said, what was that you played last night? And he said, well, it's the new call the general wants. And they had asked him for copies of it, which he said he gladly furnished. And pretty soon, all the Union buglers in that whole army, the 5th Corps, was playing that new bugle call. This call soon spread throughout the entire Union Army and was even played by Confederates by the end of the war. Shortly after it was written, it was then associated with a funeral when a local artillery unit lost a man. The captain was afraid that firing the 3 traditional volleys of muskets would start up the fighting again, so he asked his bugler simply to sound the new call in its place. So that happened in probably August of 1862. It's the first time we know that the call was played at a funeral. By the end of the Civil War, the bugle call is being played at military funerals, and of course, after the Civil War, it's played at memorial services throughout the country, and then becoming more and more associated with military funeral honors. But the Army takes a long time in changing things. In 1874, the Army changed all its bugle calls and they revised them into the modern bugle calls that we know today. They decided to use that new call of taps and put the music in there, but they still kept its name, Extinguish Lights, because that was what the call was originally supposed to do. Turn out the lights at the end of the evening. Unofficially, it was still being played at funerals, and it doesn't happen actually until 1891, almost 30 years after the Civil War, that the Army finally changes its regulations and changes the bugle call's title to taps, along with the regulation that the call is sounded at military funeral honors. And of course, from the Civil War up to this day today, the call is played at those funerals. In fact, I would venture to guess that the call is probably the most performed piece of music in the United States. If you stop and think about it, with the thousands of military funerals that take place every single day throughout the country, there's always taps that's performed at it. So that call is always being performed. So that's how the call came about, and we are grateful to two great soldiers, two great Americans who went on and became very successful businessmen after the war, General Daniel Butterfield and also Oliver Wilcox Norton, who actually went into the canning business after the Civil War and made $1 million and formed the American Can Corporation, and wrote about his experiences in playing the bugle. So, in closing today's program, I've played some of the bugle calls that you've heard, that would have been heard from the morning through the midday to the evening, the calls that were associated with the battlefield maneuvering of troops, to finally the last call, and probably the most famous call that we know today, the bugle call of taps. And I think it's very appropriate that in celebration of our nation's birthday, that we would associate this particular bugle call, because there's certainly no other bugle call that's ever been written that is closely associated with the United States. In fact, you can go anywhere in the world, and within the first 3 notes of the bugle call, people would recognize that piece of music. So it's a very important thing. And it also is a chance for us to remember those who've served our country, the men and women who have gone before us, who've worn the uniform in service to our country, those who are still today serving in far-off lands, and for those in the future who will always be there to defend our country. The one common thing that everyone in uniform has is this particular bugle call, whether it be a soldier, a Marine, a sailor, Air Force personnel, a Coast Guardsman, or any one of the other uniformed services. That bugle call is very important because it's the call that they hear in the end of the evening. So I'd like to close off my program this afternoon with a tribute to all those that have served, and also need to put in, before I do that, a plug for the Maryland National Guard, who they have a booth set up over there. So if you get a chance, and we have the young sergeant over there in his Class Bs waving over there. So if you get a chance, go over and talk to them. Tell you about some of the great things that the National Guard does for us Marylanders every single day, not only here in Maryland, but also overseas. Also, I'd like to thank the folks here at Middletown Park for having me, and in tribute to all those who served, I'd like for everyone within the sound of my voice to just pause for a second and stand at attention, and we'll close with taps. Thank you very much.